At the beginning of the 23-24 season, Tyrese Haliburton was on a historic run to kick off the year, putting up borderline MVP level numbers and was looking like the next coming of a superstar in the league, doing all of this at just the age of 23. The Indiana Pacers knew they had their guy, their franchise player that they could build around with for the future to bring them back to relevance. And with the Pacers starting off the year going 23-15 and ahead of schedule in their retool after trading away Domantas Sabonis, they knew they had an opportunity on their hands to really accelerate their timeline to start truly competing in the Eastern Conference. With the Raptors heading down their own rebuild and selling off most of their valuable pieces at the deadline, the Pacers jumped on the Raptors' biggest name, former All-Star and All-NBA player, in Pascal Siakam, but doing so at a cost, the price of 3 first-round picks, protections on those picks, but still 3 first-round picks nonetheless. For a small market team like Indiana, signing big-name free agents is hard to come by, and this was their way of signing an all-star who was soon to be a free agent that they would later sign to a max contract extension at 4 years, $118.5 million over this past summer. And while the Pacers would go on to advance to the conference finals this past season, albeit maybe a little bit of a fluky run with injuries to the Bucks in the first round and the Knicks in the second, but they made it regardless for the first time in a decade, and the Pacers would look to build on that success going into this season, having locked up Siakam and Haliburton, continuing to progress towards his prime. But so far, in the early going of the season, things have not worked out the way the Pacers had envisioned. Having gone 10-15 in their first 25 games with some bad losses to some of the worst teams in the league, a once dynamite offensive team last season has turned to be mid, one of the bottom teams in the league defensively as well. And to make matters worse, their schedule is only going to get harder from here on out. So where do the Pacers go from here, and how worried should their fans be? If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe, and in return, I'll be providing more NBA content like this. Now, last season, the Indiana Pacers had one of the most efficient offenses we had ever seen in NBA history, putting up a historic 123.3 points per game, second in the league in overall pace, and 121 points per 100 possessions, good enough for second in overall offensive rating last season. The Pacers going into that season were projected to miss the playoffs and had an over-under of 38.5, and of course, they would ultimately exceed those expectations, winning 47 games and going to the conference finals. Their defense wasn't good. In fact, they finished 24th in the league in defensive rating, but their offense was so fast and efficient that it made up for their deficiencies on the other end of the floor. And the Pacers hope to double down on that success by maintaining their pace of play and getting up as many shots as possible for a team that finished in the league in overall field goal attempts and number 1 in field goal percentage at over 50%. But so far this season, it's been a stark contrast from what we saw of this team last year. They haven't been as efficient on offense, they're not getting downhill in transition as quickly, they're not getting up as many shots, especially from behind the arc, and they're shooting it at a lower percentage. All the while, their defense remains just as bad as it did last season, if not worse. So what's going on? How could a team that more or less ran it back and kept the same roster, re-signing all their key free agents, see such a sudden decline in their offense? Well, it's for a number of factors, which I'll get into, but the main one is that the league has figured out how to stop the Pacers' high-powered offense. They know if they can force the ball along the perimeter, stop transition plays from happening early, and force the Pacers away from the pick and roll and take lower percentage shots, they have a good chance at beating that team. Hell, even just trying to beat the Pacers in a shootout will often work because the Pacers are that bad on defense. Of course, the other factor is Tyrese Haliburton. He simply put has to be better. For a guy they just signed to a 5-year, $244 million contract extension, a contract that just went into effect this season, he has to be showing up better. And I don't even mean that only with his play on the court, which has seen a massive regression from that one-hit wonder start last season before he got injured. I also mean that in how he's showing up as a leader. His body language, his demeanor, and overall engagement and energy has not been good. Now, yes, to be fair, any team that is falling below expectations, any player who is going through a rough stretch in their overall play isn't going to be happy-go-lucky and hyped every time they step onto the court. But this is his team. He's the franchise player. It's not Pascal Siakam's, as much as some people like to claim it is. No, it's his team. And you have to show up as that leader even during the hard times, the down stretches, to motivate, energize, and keep the players' heads up. Now, as far as his play on the court, I mean, you're talking about a guy who's regressed big time in his overall offensive output and efficiency. His shooting numbers are down significantly from a player just a couple of seasons ago as one of the most efficient, high-volume three-point shooters in the league, shooting over 40% from deep. This season, he's shooting at just 33% on on high volume with some very poor shot selection, contested threes, the worst timing without setting up a play. His finishing at the rim also isn't what it used to be. He's not getting to the foul line at the rate that we used to see, and while he remains one of the better passing point guards in the league and a great floor general, he's well below what we're used to seeing for a guy who finished first in the league in assists last season. Now, I will say, some of this is on Rick Carlisle. Like, as great of a coach as I think he is, he's not coaching this team to their true potential, and he's not utilizing the guys to the best of their abilities. Haliburton's overall usage and shot attempts are at the lowest since he's been traded from the Kings, and that can't happen. You can't have your franchise player getting less touches and less attempts if he is struggling with his overall consistency on offense. He needs to have the ball in his hands as much as he did last season, if not more, to really get the most of this team's offense. Now, that said, teams, like I mentioned, have figured out the Pacers' offense and are forcing the ball out of Haliburton's hands. But again, that's on the coach to make the proper adjustments to fix these issues and get the team back to a place where they were successful and capitalizing on what was working. Now, Siakam is not absolved of any blame here. He's got to be better. He just got a max contract extension and is already having a down year under that new contract. He hasn't been as aggressive in attacking the paint or crashing the boards, and his overall percentage from the floor and the shot attempts are down in general. But again, it goes back to teams having figured out the Indiana Pacers offense. What they relied upon so much and did absolutely nothing to improve on the other end of the floor. And that sits with the front office and not making the right personnel changes to truly maximize this team's potential in getting them to the next level. Because as good as the Pacers were last season, they were not a legitimate championship level team. They weren't going to surpass a team like the Celtics or even the Knicks after the offseason moves they made. They needed to round out their roster by bolstering their defense, and they did nothing to improve that. So where do the Pacers go from here? Because while yes, it's still early in the season, it's pretty clear that after 25 games in, this team isn't it. They're not making a deep run to the playoffs, and I wouldn't even be shocked if they missed the playoffs, getting knocked out of the play-in if they maintain the roster as is. So what do? Well, it's very unlikely that the Pacers would just tear this all down and be sellers at the deadline, trading off their most valuable assets and just tanking the rest of the season and starting fresh on a rebuild. They're not going to do that after just going all in on Siakam and Haliburton. So if anything, it's likely going to be the opposite, where they become big buyers at the deadline and double down on this core and push to win now by trading away future assets to bolster their roster. But I guess the question is, what would that be? There has been talk that the Pacers could look at Walker Kessler to give them some depth at the 5 and provide more rim protection or just general defense, rebounding, shot blocking, something the Pacers desperately need. But the word around the league is that the Jazz are seeking around 2 first-round picks for Kessler, which you have to ask yourself if you're the Pacers, is it worth it? 2 first-round picks for a solid player, but likely nothing more than a rotational player at best. He's not going to raise your ceiling significantly. Sure, they could try and make a play at Brandon Ingram, but I don't think he really moves the needle for you, especially defensively, and you're going to have to pay him when you already have so much long-term committed money on the books to Siakam and Haliburton. I just don't see a lot of players that are available on the trade market that could really put the Pacers into contention. And if I'm the Pacers, that's what really worries me right now, because you're stuck in a hard place where you're not good enough to contend as currently constructed, your franchise player is performing below expectations, and you're not really in a position to just start tanking either, having given up some of your future draft capital. The Pacers really need to figure out a way to turn this thing around with what they have, or they could be in a really bad place and shape for the foreseeable future. I would love to hear what you guys think though. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.